Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 16. Far in a wild unknown to public view, from youth to age a reverend hermit grew. The moss his bed, the cave his humble cell, his food the fruits, his drink the crystal well. Remote from man, with God he passed his days, prayer all his business, all his pleasure praise. The reader cannot have forgotten that the event of the tournament was decided by the exertions of an unknown knight, whom, on account of the passive and indifferent conduct which he had manifested on the former part of the day, the spectators had entitled Le Noir Fainéant. This knight had left the field abruptly when the victory was achieved, and when he was called upon to receive the reward of his valour, he was nowhere to be found. In the meantime, while summoned by heralds and by trumpets, the knight was holding his course northward, avoiding all frequented paths, and taking the shortest road through the woodlands. He paused for the night at a small hostelry, lying out of the ordinary route, where, however, he obtained from a wandering minstrel news of the event of the tourney. On the next morning the knight departed early, with the intention of making a long journey. The condition of his horse, which he had carefully spared during the preceding morning, being such as enabled him to travel far without the necessity of much repose. Yet his purpose was baffled by the devious paths through which he rode, so that when evening closed upon him, he only found himself on the frontiers of the West Riding of Yorkshire. By this time both horse and man required refreshment, and it became necessary, moreover, to look out for some place in which they might spend the night, which was now fast approaching. The place where the traveller found himself seemed unpropitious for obtaining either shelter or refreshment, and he was likely to be reduced to the usual expedient of knights errant, who, on such occasions, turned their horses to graze, and laid themselves down to meditate on their lady mistress, with an oak tree for a canopy. But the Black Knight either had no mistress to meditate upon, or, being as indifferent in love as he seemed to be in war, was not sufficiently occupied by passionate reflections upon her beauty and cruelty to be able to parry the effects of fatigue and hunger, and suffer love to act as a substitute for the solid comforts of a bed and supper. He felt dissatisfied, therefore, when, looking around, he found himself deeply involved in woods, through which indeed there were many open glades, and some paths, but such as seemed only formed by the numerous herds of cattle which grazed in the forest, or by the animals of chase, and the hunters who made prey of them. The sun, by which the knight had chiefly directed his course, had now sunk behind the Derbyshire hills on his left, and every effort which he might make to pursue his journey was as likely to lead him out of his road as to advance him on his route. After having in vain endeavoured to select the most beaten path, in hopes it might lead to the cottage of some herdsman or the sylvan lodge of a forester, and having repeatedly found himself totally unable to determine on a choice, the knight resolved to trust to the sagacity of his horse, experience having on former occasions made him acquainted with the wonderful talent possessed by these animals for extricating themselves and their riders on such emergencies. The good steed, grievously fatigued with so long a day's journey under a rider cased in mail, had no sooner found, by the slackened reins, that he was abandoned to his own guidance, than he seemed to assume new strength and spirit; and whereas formerly he had scarce replied to the spur otherwise than by a groan, he now, as if proud of the confidence reposed in him, pricked up his ears, and assumed of his own accord a more lively motion. The path which the animal adopted rather turned off from the course pursued by the knight during the day, but as the horse seemed confident in his choice, the rider abandoned himself to his discretion. He was justified by the event, for the footpath soon after appeared a little wider and more worn, and the tinkle of a small bell gave the knight to understand that he was in the vicinity of some chapel or hermitage. Accordingly, he soon reached an open plat of turf, on the opposite side of which a rock, rising abruptly from a gently sloping plain, offered its grey and weather-beaten front to the traveller. Ivy mantled its sides in some places, and in others oaks and holly bushes, whose roots found nourishment in the cliffs of the crag, waved over the precipices below like the plumage of the warrior over his steel helmet, giving grace to that whose chief expression was terror. At the bottom of the rock, and leaning, as it were, against it, was constructed a rude hut, built chiefly of the trunks of trees felled in the neighbouring forest, and secured against the weather by having its crevices stuffed with moss mingled with clay. The stem of a young fir tree lopped off its branches, with a piece of wood tied across near the top, was planted upright by the door as a rude emblem of the Holy Cross. At a little distance on the right hand, a fountain of the purest water trickled out of the rock, and was received in a hollow stone, which labour had formed into a rustic basin. Escaping from thence, the stream murmured down the descent by a channel which his course had long worn, and so wandered through the little plain to lose itself in the neighbouring wood. Beside this fountain were the ruins of a very small chapel, of which the roof had partly fallen in. The building, when entire, had never been above 16 feet long by 12 feet in breadth, and the roof, low in proportion, rested upon 4 concentric arches, which sprung from the 4 corners of the building, each supported upon a short and heavy pillar. The ribs of 2 of these arches remained, though the roof had fallen down betwixt them. Over the others it remained entire. The entrance to this ancient place of devotion was under a very low round arch, ornamented by several courses of that zigzag moulding, resembling shark's teeth, which appears so often in the more ancient Saxon architecture. A belfry rose above the porch on 4 small pillars, within which hung the green and weather-beaten bell, the feeble sounds of which had been some time before heard by the Black Knight. The whole peaceful and quiet scene lay glimmering in twilight before the eyes of the traveller, giving him good assurance of lodging for the night, since it was a special duty of those hermits who dwelt in the woods to exercise hospitality towards benighted or bewildered passengers. Accordingly, the knight took no time to consider minutely the particulars which we have detailed, but, thanking Saint Julian, the patron of travellers, who had sent him good harbourage, he leaped from his horse, and assailed the door of the hermitage with the butt of his lance, in order to arouse attention and gain admittance. It was some time before he obtained any answer, and the reply, when made, was unpropitious. "Pass on, whosoever thou art," was the answer given by a deep hoarse voice from within the hut, "and disturb not the servant of God and Saint Dunstan in his evening devotions." "Worthy father," answered the knight, "here is a poor wanderer bewildered in these woods, who gives thee the opportunity of exercising thy charity and hospitality." "Good brother," replied the inhabitant of the hermitage, "it has pleased Our Lady and Saint Dunstan to destine me for the object of those virtues, instead of the exercise thereof. I have no provisions here which even a dog would share with me, and a horse of any tenderness of nurture would despise my couch. Pass therefore on thy way, and God speed thee." "But how," replied the knight, "is it possible for me to find my way through such a wood as this, when darkness is coming on? I pray you, reverend father, as you are a Christian, to undo your door, and at least point out to me thy road." "And I pray you, good Christian brother," replied the anchorite, "to disturb me no more. You have already interrupted 1 pater, 2 aves, and a credo, which I, miserable sinner that I am, should, according to my vow, have said before moonrise." "The road, the road!" vociferated the knight. "Give me directions for the road, if I am to expect no more from thee." "The road," replied the hermit, "is easy to hit. The path from the wood leads to a morass, and from thence to a ford, which, as the rains have abated, may now be passable. When thou hast crossed the ford, thou wilt take care of thy footing up the left bank, as it is somewhat precipitous, and the path, which hangs over the river, has lately, as I learn, for I seldom leave the duties of my chapel, given way in sundry places. Thou wilt then keep straight forward. A broken path, a precipice, a ford, and a morass!" said the knight, interrupting him. "Sir Hermit, if you were the holiest that ever wore beard or told bead, you shall scarce prevail on me to hold this road to-night. I tell thee that thou, who livest by the charity of the country, ill deserved as I doubt it is, hast no right to refuse shelter to the wayfarer when in distress. Either open the door quickly, or by the rod I will beat it down and make entry for myself." "Friend wayfarer," replied the hermit, "be not importunate. If thou puttest me to use the carnal weapon in mine own defence, it will be e'en the worse for you." At this moment a distant noise of barking and growling, which the traveller had for some time heard, became extremely loud and furious, and made the knight suppose that the hermit, alarmed by his threat of making forcible entry, had called the dogs, who made this clamour to aid him in his defence, out of some inner recess in which they had been kennelled. Incensed at this preparation on the hermit's part for making good his inhospitable purpose, the knight struck the door so furiously with his foot, that posts as well as staples shook with violence. The anchorite, not caring again to expose his door to a similar shock, now called out aloud, "Patience, patience! Spare thy strength, good traveller, and I will presently undo the door, though it may be my doing so will be little to thy pleasure." The door accordingly was opened, and the hermit, a large, strong-built man, in his sackcloth gown and hood, girt with a rope of rushes, stood before the knight. He had in one hand a lighted torch, or link, and in the other a baton of crab-tree, so thick and heavy that it might well be termed a club. Two large shaggy dogs, half greyhound, half mastiff, stood ready to rush upon the traveller as soon as the door should be opened. But when the torch glanced upon the lofty crest and golden spurs of the knight who stood without, the hermit, altering probably his original intentions, repressed the rage of his auxiliaries, and changing his tone to a sort of churlish courtesy, invited the knight to enter his hut, making excuse for his unwillingness to open his lodge after sunset, by alleging the multitude of robbers and outlaws who were abroad, and who gave no honour to Our Lady or Saint Dunstan, nor to those holy men who spent life in their service. "The poverty of your cell, good father," said the knight, looking around him, and seeing nothing but a bed of leaves, a crucifix rudely carved in oak, a missal with a rough-hewn table and 2 stools, and 1 or 2 clumsy articles of furniture, "the poverty of your cell should seem a sufficient defence against any risk of thieves, not to mention the aid of 2 trusty dogs, large and strong enough, I think, to pull down a stag, and of course to match with most men." "The good keeper of the forest," said the hermit, "hath allowed me the use of these animals to protect my solitude until the times shall mend." Having said this, he fixed his torch in a twisted branch of iron which served for a candlestick, and placing the oaken trivet before the embers of the fire, which he refreshed with some dry wood, he placed a stool upon one side of the table, and beckoned to the knight to do the same upon the other. They sat down and gazed with great gravity at each other, each thinking in his heart that he had seldom seen a stronger or more athletic figure than was placed opposite to him. "Reverend hermit," said the knight, after looking long and fixedly at his host, "were it not to interrupt your devout meditations, I would pray to know 3 things of your holiness. First, where am I to put my horse? Secondly, what can I have for supper? Thirdly, where am I to take up my couch for the night?" "I will reply to you," said the hermit, "with my finger, it being against my rule to speak by words where signs can answer the purpose." So saying, he pointed successively to 2 corners of the hut. "Your stable," said he, "is there, your bed there, and," reaching down a platter with 2 handfuls of parched peas upon it from the neighbouring shelf, and placing it upon the table, he added, Your supper is here." The knight shrugged his shoulders, and leaving the hut, brought in his horse, which in the interim he had fastened to a tree, unsaddled him with much attention, and spread upon the steed's weary back his own mantle. The hermit was apparently somewhat moved to compassion by the anxiety as well as address which the stranger displayed in tending his horse; for, muttering something about provender left for the keeper's palfrey, he dragged out of a recess a bundle of forage, which he spread before the knight's charger, and immediately afterwards shook down a quantity of dried fern in the corner which he had assigned for the rider's couch. The knight returned him thanks for his courtesy, and this duty done, both resumed their seats by the table, whereon stood the trencher of peas placed between them. The hermit, after a long grace, which had once been Latin, but of which original language few traces remained, excepting here and there the long rolling termination of some word or phrase, set example to his guest by modestly putting into a very large mouth, furnished with teeth which might have ranked with those of a boar, both in sharpness and whiteness, some 3 or 4 dried peas, a miserable grist, as it seemed, for so large and able a mill. The knight, in order to follow so laudable an example, laid aside his helmet, his corslet, and the greater part of his armour, and showed to the hermit a head, thick curled with yellow hair, high features, blue eyes, remarkably bright and sparkling, a mouth well formed, having an upper lip clothed with mustachoes darker than his hair, and bearing altogether the look of a bold, daring, and enterprising man, with which his strong form well corresponded. The hermit, as if wishing to answer to the confidence of his guest, threw back his cowl, and showed a round bullet head, belonging to a man in the prime of life. His close-shaven crown, surrounded by a circle of stiff curled black hair, had something the appearance of a parish pinfold begirt by its high hedge. The features expressed nothing of monastic austerity, or of ascetic privations. On the contrary, it was a bold, bluff countenance, with broad black eyebrows, a well-turned forehead, and cheeks as round and vermilion as those of a trumpeter, from which descended a long and curly black beard. Such a visage, joined to the brawny form of the holy man, spoke rather of sirloins and haunches than of peas and pulse. This incongruity did not escape the guest. After he had with great difficulty accomplished the mastication of a mouthful of the dried peas, he found it absolutely necessary to request his pious entertainer to furnish him with some liquor, who replied to his request by placing before him a large can of the purest water from the fountain. "It is from the well of St. Dunstan," said he, "in which betwixt sun and sun he baptized 500 heathen Danes and Britons, blessed be his name." And applying his black beard to the pitcher, he took a draught much more moderate in quantity than his economium seemed to warrant. "It seems to me, reverend father," said the knight, "that the small morsels which you eat, together with this holy but somewhat thin beverage, have thriven with you marvellously. You appear a man more fit to win the ram at a wrestling match, or the ring at a bout at quarterstaff, or the bucklers at a sword play, than to linger out your time in this desolate wilderness, saying masses and living upon parched peas and cold water." "Sir Knight," answered the hermit, "your thoughts, like those of the ignorant laity, are according to the flesh. It has pleased Our Lady and my patron saint to bless the pittance to which I restrain myself, even as the pulse and water was blessed to the children Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who drank the same, rather than defile themselves with the wine and meats which were appointed them by the King of the Saracens." "Holy father," said the knight, "upon whose countenance it hath pleased heaven to work such a miracle, permit a sinful layman to crave thy name?" "Thou mayst call me," answered the hermit, "the Clerk of Copmanhurst, for so I am termed in these parts. They add, it is true, the epithet holy, but I stand not upon that, as being unworthy of such addition. And now, valiant knight, may I pray ye for the name of my honourable guest?" "Truly," said the knight, Holy Clerk of Copmanhurst, men call me in these parts the Black Knight. Many, sir, add to it the epithet of sluggard, whereby I am no way ambitious to be distinguished." The hermit could scarcely forbear from smiling at his guest's reply. "I see," said he, "Sir Sluggish Knight, that thou art a man of prudence and of counsel. And, moreover, I see that my poor monastic fare likes thee not, accustomed, perhaps, as thou hast been to the license of courts and of camps, and the luxuries of cities. And now I bethink me, Sir Sluggard, that when the charitable keeper of this forest walk left these dogs for my protection, and also those bundles of forage, he left me also some food, which, being unfit for my use, the very recollection of it has escaped me amid my more weighty meditations." "Dare I be sworn he did so," said the knight. "I was convinced that there was better food in the cell, holy clerk, since you first doffed your cowl. Your keeper is ever a jovial fellow, and none who beheld thy grinders contending with these peas, and thy throat flooded with this ungenial element, could see thee doomed to such horse provender and horse beverage," pointing to the provisions upon the table, "and refrain from mending thy cheer. Let us the keeper's bounty, therefore, without delay." The hermit cast a wistful look upon the knight, in which there was a sort of comic expression of hesitation, as if uncertain how far he should act prudently in trusting his guest. There was, however, as much of bold frankness in the knight's countenance as was possible to be expressed by features. His smile, too, had something in it irresistibly comic, and gave an assurance of faith and loyalty, with which his host could not refrain from sympathizing. After exchanging a mute glance or two, the hermit went to the further side of the hut, and opened a hutch which was concealed with great care and some ingenuity. Out of the recesses of a dark closet, into which this aperture gave admittance, he brought a large pasty, baked in a pewter platter of unusual dimensions. This mighty dish he placed before his guest, who, using his poniard to cut it open, lost no time in making himself acquainted with its contents. "How long is it since the good keeper has been here?" said the knight to his host, after having swallowed several hasty morsels of this reinforcement to the hermit's good cheer. "About 2 months," answered the father hastily. "By the true Lord," answered the knight, "everything in your hermitage is miraculous, holy clerk, for I would have been sworn that the fat buck which furnishes this venison had been running on foot within the week." The hermit was somewhat discountenanced by this observation, and, moreover, he made but a poor figure while gazing on the diminution of the pastry, on which his guest was making desperate inroads. A warfare in which his previous profession of abstinence left him no pretext for joining. "I have been in Palestine, Sir Clerk," said the knight, stopping short of a sudden, "and I bethink me it is a custom there that every host who entertains a guest shall assure him of the wholesomeness of his food by partaking of it along with him. Far be it from me to suspect so holy a man of aught inhospitable. Nevertheless, I will be highly bound to you would you comply with this Eastern custom." "To ease your unnecessary scruples, Sir Knight, I will for once depart from my rule," replied the hermit. And as there were no forks in those days, his clutches were instantly in the bowels of the pasty. The ice of the ceremony being once broken, it seemed a matter of rivalry between the guest and the entertainer which should display the best appetite, and although the former had probably fasted longest, yet the hermit fairly surpassed him. "Holy clerk," said the knight, when his hunger was appeased, "I would gage my good horse yonder against a zecchin, that the same honest keeper, to whom we are obliged for the venison, has left thee a stoup of wine, or a runlet of canary, or some such trifle by way of ally to this noble pasty. This would be a circumstance, doubtless, totally unworthy to dwell in the memory of so rigid an anchorite. Yet, I think, were you to search yonder crypt once more, you would find that I am right in my conjecture." The hermit only replied by a grin, and returning to the hutch, he produced a leathern bottle, which might contain about 4 quarts. He also brought forth 2 large drinking cups, made out of the horn of the urus, and hooped with silver. Having made this goodly provision for washing down the supper, he seemed to think no farther ceremonious scruple necessary on his part, but, filling both cups, and saying, in the Saxon fashion, "Beas hael, Sir Sluggish Knight," he emptied his own at a draught. "Drink hael, Holy Clerk of Copmanhurst," answered the warrior, and did his host reason in a similar brimmer. "Holy Clerk," said the stranger, after the first cup was thus swallowed, "I cannot but marvel that a man possessed of such thews and sinews as thine, and who therewithal shows the talent of so goodly a trencherman, should think of abiding by himself in this wilderness. In my judgment, you are fitter to keep a castle or a fort, eating of the fat and drinking of the strong, than to live here upon pulse and water, or even upon the charity of the keeper. At least, were I as thou, I should find myself both disport and plenty out of the king's deer. There is many a goodly herd in these forests, and a buck will never be missed that goes to the use of St. Dunstan's chaplain." "Sir Sluggish Knight," replied the clerk, "these are dangerous words, and I pray you to forbear them. I am true hermit to the king and law, and were I to spoil my liege's game, I should be sure of the prison, and my gown saved me not, were in some peril of hanging." "Nevertheless, were I as thou," said the knight, "I would take my walk by moonlight, when foresters and keepers were warm in bed, and ever and anon, as I pattered my prayers, I would let fly a shaft among the herds of dun deer that feed in the glades. Resolve me, Holy Clerk, hast thou never practised such a pastime?" "Friend Sluggard," answered the hermit, "thou hast seen all that concern thee of my housekeeping, and something more than he deserves who takes up his quarters by violence. Credit me, it is better to enjoy the good which God sends thee, than to be impertinently curious how it comes. Fill thy cup, and welcome. And do not, I pray thee, by further impertinent inquiries, put me to show that thou couldst hardly have made good thy lodging, had I been earnest to oppose thee." "By my faith," said the knight, "thou makest me more curious than ever. Thou art the most mysterious hermit I ever met, and I will know more of thee ere we part. As for thy threats, know, holy man, thou speakest to one whose trade it is to find out danger wherever it is to be met with." "Sir Sluggish Knight, I drink to thee," said the hermit, "respecting thy valour much, but deeming wondrous slightly of thy discretion. If thou wilt take equal arms with me, I will give thee, in all friendship and brotherly love, such sufficing penance and complete absolution, that thou shalt not for the next 12 months sin the sin of excess of curiosity." The knight pledged him, and desired him to name his weapons. "There is none," replied the hermit, "from the scissors of Delilah and the 10-penny nail of Jael to the scimitar of Goliath, at which I am not a match for thee. But if I am to make the election, what sayest thou, good friend, to these trinkets?" Thus speaking, he opened another hutch, and took out from it a couple of broadswords and bucklers, such as were used by the yeomanry of the period. The knight, who watched his motions, observed that this second place of concealment was furnished with 2 or 3 good long bows, a crossbow, a bundle of bolts for the latter, and half a dozen sheaves of arrows for the former. A harp, and other matters of very uncanonical appearance, were also visible when this dark recess was opened. "I promise thee, brother clerk," said he, "I will ask thee no more offensive questions. The contents of that cupboard are an answer to all my inquiries, and I see a weapon there." Here he stopped and took out the harp, "on which I would more gladly prove my skill with thee than at the sword and buckler." "I hope, Sir Knight," said the hermit, "thou hast given no good reason for thy surname of the Sluggard. I do promise thee I suspect thee grievously. Nevertheless, thou art my guest, and I will not put thy manhood to the proof without thine own free will. Sit thee down, then, and fill thy cup. Let us drink, sing, and be merry. If thou knowest ever a good lay, thou shalt be welcome to a nook of pasty at Copmanhurst, so long as I deserve the chapel of St Dunstan, which, please God, shall be till I change my grey covering for one of green turf. But come, fill a flagon, for it will crave some time to tune the harp, and naught pitches the voice and sharpens the ear like a cup of wine. For my part, I love to feel the grape at my very finger ends before they make the harp strings tingle. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Tune created and sung by John Scott Jones. Chapter 17. At eve, within yon studious nook, I ope my brass-embossed book, portrayed with many a holy deed, of martyrs crowned with heavenly meed. Then, as my taper waxes dim, chant ere I sleep my measured hymn. Who but would cast his pomp away, to take my staff and a mice grey, and to the world's tumultuous stage prefer the peaceful hermitage? Warton. Notwithstanding the prescription of the genial hermit, with which his guest willingly complied, he found it no easy matter to bring the harp to harmony. "Methinks, holy father," said he, "the instrument wants one string, and the rest have been somewhat misused." "Ay, mark'st thou that?" replied the hermit. "That shows thee a master of the craft. Wine and wassail," he said, gravely casting up his eyes. "All the fault of wine and wassail. I told Allan a Dale, the northern minstrel, that he would damage the harp if he touched it after the 7th cup, but he would not be controlled. Friend, I drink to thy successful performance." So saying, he took off his cup with much gravity, at the same time shaking his head at the intemperance of the Scottish harper. The knight, in the meantime, had brought the strings into some order, and after a short prelude, asked his host whether he would choose a sirvente in the language of Oc, or a lay in the language of Oui, or a virelay, or a ballad in the vulgar English. "A ballad," said the hermit, "against all the Ocs and Ouis of France. Downright English am I, Sir Knight, and downright English was my patron, St Dunstan, and scorned Oc and Oui, as he would have scorned the parings of the devil's hoof. Downright English alone shall be sung in this cell." "I will essay, then," said the knight, "a ballad composed by a Saxon gleeman, whom I knew in Holy Land." It speedily appeared that if the knight was not a complete master of the minstrel art, his taste for it had at least been cultivated under the best instructors. Art had taught him to soften the faults of a voice which had little compass, and was naturally rough rather than mellow, and, in short, had done all that culture can do in supplying natural deficiencies. His performance, therefore, might have been termed very respectable by abler judges than the hermit, especially as the knight threw into the notes a degree of spirit, and now of a plaintive enthusiasm, which gave force and energy to the verses which he sung. The Crusaders' Return.
High deeds achieved of knightly fame, from Palestine the champion came, the cross upon his shoulders borne, battle and blast had dimmed and torn, each dint upon his battered shield was token of a foughten field, and thus beneath his lady's bower he sung as fell the twilight hour. Joy to the fair thy knight, behold, returned from yonder land of gold. No wealth he brings, nor wealth can need, save his good arms and battle steed, his spurs to dash against a foe, his lance and sword to lay him low. Such all the trophies of his toil, such and the hope of tactless smile. Joy to the fair whose constant knight her favour fired to feats of might. Unnoted shall she not remain, where meet the bright and noble train. Minstrel shall sing and herald tell, mark yonder maid of beauty well. 'Tis she for whose bright eyes were won the listed field at Ascalon. Note well her smile, it edged the blade which 50 wives to widows made. When vain his strength and Mahon's spell, Iconian's turban Sultan fell. Seest thou her locks whose sunny glow half shows, half shades her neck of snow? Twines not of them one golden thread, but for its sake a Paynim bled. Joy to the fair, my name unknown, each deed and all its praise thine own. Then, oh, unbar this churlish gate, the night dew falls, the hour is late. Inured to Syria's glowing breath, I feel the north breeze chill as death. Let grateful love quell maiden shame, and grant him bliss who brings thee fame.
During this performance, the hermit demeaned himself much like a first-rate critic of the present day at a new opera. He reclined back upon his seat, with his eyes half shut, now folding his hands and twisting his thumbs. He seemed absorbed in attention, and anon, balancing his expanded palms, he gently flourished them in time to the music. At one or two favourite cadences he threw in a little assistance of his own, where the knight's voice seemed unable to carry the air so high as his worshipful taste approved. When the song was ended, the anchorite emphatically declared it was a good one, and well sung. "And yet," said he, "I think my Saxon countrymen had heard it long enough with the Normans to fall into the tone of their melancholy ditties. What took the honest knight from home? Or what could he expect but to find his mistress agreeably engaged with a rival on his return, and his serenade, as they call it, as little regarded as the caterwauling of a cat in the gutter? Nevertheless, Sir Knight, I drink this cup to thee, to the success of all true lovers. I fear you are none," he added, on observing that the knight, whose brain began to be heated with these repeated draughts, qualified his flagon from the water-pitcher. "Why," said the knight, "did you not tell me that this water was from the well of your blessed patron, St. Dunstan?" "Ay, truly," said the hermit, "and many a hundred of pagans did he baptize there, but I never heard that he drank any of it. Everything should be put into its proper use in this world. St. Dunstan knew, as well as any one, the prerogatives of a jovial friar." And so saying, he reached the harp, and entertained his guest with the following characteristic song, to a sort of derry-down chorus appropriate to an old English ditty. Begin note. It may be proper to remind the reader that the chorus of Derry Down is supposed to be as ancient not only as the times of the Heptarchy, but as those of the Druids, and to have furnished the chorus to the hymns of those venerable persons when they went to the wood to gather mistletoe. End note. The Barefooted Friar.
I'll give thee, good fellow, a 12-month or twain, to search Europe through from Byzantium to Spain. But ne'er shall you find, should you search till you tire, so happy a man as the barefooted friar. Your knight for his lady pricks forth in career, and is brought home at evensong pricked through with the spear. I confess him in haste, for his lady desires no comfort on earth save the barefooted friars. Your monarch shall many a prince has been known to barter his robes for our cowl and our gown. But which of us e'er felt the idle desire to exchange for a crown the grey hood of a friar? The friar has walked out, and where'er he has gone, the land and its fatness is marked for his own. He can roam where he lists, he can stop when he tires, for every man's house is the barefooted friar. He's expected at noon, and no white till he comes may profane the great chair or the porridge of plums. For the best of the cheer and the seat by the fire is the undenied right of the barefooted friar. He's expected at night, and the pasties made hot. They broach the brown ale, and they fill the black pot. And the good wife would wish the good man in the mire, ere he lacked a soft pillow, the barefooted friar. Long flourish the sandal, the cord, and the cope, the dread of the devil, and trust of the Pope. For to gather life's roses unscathed by the briar is granted alone to the barefooted friar.
"By my troth," said the knight, "thou hast sung well and lustily, and in high praise of thine order. And talking of the devil, holy clerk, are you not afraid that he may pay you a visit during some of your uncanonical pastimes?" "I uncanonical!" answered the hermit. "I scorn the charge. I scorn it with my heels. I serve the duty of my chapel duly and truly. 2 masses daily, morning and evening, primes, noons, and vespers, aves, credos, paters." "Excepting moonlight nights, when the venison is in season," said his guest. "Exceptis excipiendis," replied the hermit, "as our old abbot taught me to say, when impertinent laymen should ask me if I kept every punctilio of mine order." "True, holy father," said the knight, "but the devil is apt to keep an eye on such exceptions. He goes about, thou knowest, like a roaring lion." "Let him roar here if he dares," said the friar. "A touch of my cord will make him roar as loud as the tongues of St. Dunstan himself did. I never feared man, and I as little fear the devil and his imps. St. Dunstan, St. Dubric, St. Winibald, St. Winifred, St. Swibert, St. Willick, not forgetting St. Thomas a Kent, and my own poor merits to speed, I defy every devil of them, come cut and long tail. But to let you into a secret, I never speak upon such subjects, my friend, until after morning vespers." He changed the conversation. Fast and furious grew the mirth of the parties, and many a song was exchanged betwixt them, when their revels were interrupted by a loud knocking at the door of the hermitage. The occasion of this interruption we can only explain by resuming the adventures of another set of our characters, for, like old Ariosto, we do not pique ourselves upon continuing uniformly to keep company with any one personage of our drama. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Away! Our journey lies through dell and dingle, where the blithe fawn trips by its timid mother, where the broad oak with intercepting boughs checkers the sunbeam in the greensward alley. Up and away! For lovely paths are these to tread when the glad sun is on his throne, less pleasant and less safe when Cynthia's lamp with doubtful glimmer lights the dreary forest. Ettrick Forest. When Cedric the Saxon saw his son drop down senseless in the lists at Ashby, his first impulse was to order him into the custody and care of his own attendants. But the words choked in his throat. He could not bring himself to acknowledge, in presence of such an assembly, the son whom he had renounced and disinherited. He ordered, however, Oswald to keep an eye upon him, and directed that officer, with 2 of his serfs, to convey Ivanhoe to Ashby as soon as the crowd had dispersed. Oswald, however, was anticipated in this good office. The crowd dispersed, indeed, but the knight was nowhere to be seen. It was in vain that Cedric's cupbearer looked around for his young master. He saw the bloody spot on which he had lately sunk down, but himself he saw no longer. It seemed as if the fairies had conveyed him from the spot. Perhaps Oswald, for the Saxons were very superstitious, might have adopted some such hypothesis to account for Ivanhoe's disappearance, had he not suddenly cast his eye upon a person attired like a squire, in whom he recognized the features of his fellow-servant Gurth. Anxious concerning his master's fate, and in despair at his sudden disappearance, the translated swineherd was searching for him everywhere, and had neglected, in doing so, the concealment on which his own safety depended. Oswald deemed it his duty to secure Gurth, as a fugitive of whose fate his master was to judge. Renewing his enquiries concerning the fate of Ivanhoe, the only information which the cupbearer could collect from the bystanders was, that the knight had been raised with care by certain well-attired grooms, and placed in a litter belonging to a lady among the spectators, which had immediately transported him out of the press. Oswald, on receiving this intelligence, resolved to return to his master for farther instructions, carrying along with him Gurth, whom he considered in some sort as a deserter from the service of Cedric. The Saxon had been under very intense and agonizing apprehensions concerning his son, for nature had asserted her rights, in spite of the patriotic stoicism which laboured to disown her. But no sooner was he informed that Ivanhoe was in careful and probably friendly hands, that the paternal anxiety which had been excited by the dubiety of his fate gave way anew to the feeling of injured pride and resentment at what he termed Wilfred's filial disobedience. "Let him wander his way," said he. "Let those leech his wounds for whose sake he encountered them. He is fitter to do the juggling tricks of the Norman chivalry than to maintain the fame and honour of his English ancestry with the glaive and brown bill, the good old weapons of his country." "If to maintain the honour of ancestry," said Rowena, who was present, "it is sufficient to be wise in council and brave in execution. To be boldest among the bold, and gentlest among the gentle, I know no voice save his father's." "Be silent, Lady Rowena. On this subject only I hear you not. Prepare yourself for the Prince's festival. We have been summoned thither with unwonted circumstance of honour and of courtesy, such as the haughty Normans have rarely used to our race since the fatal day of Hastings. Thither will I go, were it only to show these proud Normans how little the fate of a son who could defeat their bravest can affect a Saxon." "Thither," said Rowena, "do I not go, and I pray you to beware lest what you mean for courage and constancy shall be accounted hardness of heart." "Remain at home, then, ungrateful lady," answered Cedric. "Thine is the hard heart which can sacrifice the weal of an oppressed people to an idle and unauthorized attachment. I seek the noble Athelstane, and with him attend the banquet of John of Anjou." He went accordingly to the banquet, of which we have already mentioned the principal events. Immediately upon retiring from the castle, the Saxon thanes, with their attendants, took horse, and it was during the bustle which attended their doing so, that Cedric, for the first time, cast his eyes upon the deserter Gurth. The noble Saxon had returned from the banquet, as we have seen, in no very placid humour, and wanted but a pretext for wreaking his anger upon some one. "The gyves!" he said. "The gyves! Oswald! Hundebert! Dogs and villains! Why leave ye the knave unfettered?" Without daring to remonstrate, the companions of Gurth bound him with a halter, as the readiest cord which occurred. He submitted to the operation without remonstrance, except that, darting a reproachful look at his master, he said, "This comes of loving your flesh and blood better than mine own." "To horse and forward!" said Cedric. "It is indeed full time," said the noble Athelstane, "for if we ride not the faster, the worthy Abbot Waltheof's preparations for a rare supper will be altogether spoiled." Begin note. A rare supper was a night meal, and sometimes signified a collation, which was given at a late hour, after the regular supper had made its appearance. The travellers, however, used such speed as to reach the convent of St. Withold's before the apprehended evil took place. The abbot, himself of ancient Saxon descent, received the noble Saxons with the profuse and exuberant hospitality of their nation, wherein they indulged to a late, or rather an early hour. Nor did they take leave of their reverend host the next morning, until they had shared with him a sumptuous refection. As the cavalcade left the court of the monastery, an incident happened somewhat alarming to the Saxons, who, of all people of Europe, were most addicted to a superstitious observance of omens, and to whose opinions can be traced most of those notions upon such subjects, still to be found among our popular antiquities. For the Normans, being a mixed race, and better informed according to the information of the times, had lost most of the superstitious prejudices which their ancestors had brought from Scandinavia, and piqued themselves upon thinking freely on such topics. In the present instance, the apprehension of impending evil was inspired by no less respectable a prophet than a large, lean, black dog, which, sitting upright, howled most piteously as the foremost riders left the gate, and presently afterwards, barking wildly and jumping to and fro, seemed bent upon attaching itself to the party. "I like not that music, Father Cedric," said Athelstane, for by this title of respect he was accustomed to address him. "Nor I either, uncle," said Wamba. "I greatly fear we shall have to pay the piper." "In my mind," said Athelstane, upon whose memory the abbot's good ale, for Burton was already famous for that genial liquor, had made a favourable impression, "in my mind we had better turn back and abide with the abbot until the afternoon. It is unlucky to travel where your path is crossed by a monk, a hare, or a howling dog, until you have eaten your next meal." "Away," said Cedric impatiently. "The day is already too short for our journey. For the dog, I know it to be the cur of the runaway slave Gurth, a useless fugitive like its master." So saying, and rising at the same time in his stirrups, impatient at the interruption of his journey, he launched his javelin at poor Fangs. For Fangs it was, who, having traced his master thus far upon his stolen expedition, had here lost him, and was now on his uncouth way, rejoicing at his reappearance. The javelin inflicted a wound upon the animal's shoulder, and narrowly missed pinning him to the earth, and Fangs fled, howling, from the presence of the enraged Thane. Gurth's heart swelled within him, for he felt this meditated slaughter of his faithful adherent in a degree much deeper than the harsh treatment he had himself received. Having in vain attempted to raise his hand to his eyes, he said to Wamba, who, seeing his master's ill humour, had prudently retreated to the rear, "I pray thee, do me the kindness to wipe my eyes with the skirt of thy mantle. The dust offends me, and these bonds will not let me help myself one way or another." Wamba did him the service he required, and they rode side by side for some time, during which Gurth maintained a moody silence. At length he could repress his feelings no longer. "Friend Wamba," said he, "of all those who are fools enough to serve Cedric, thou alone hast dexterity enough to make thy folly acceptable to him. Go to him, therefore, and tell him that neither for love nor fear will Gurth serve him longer. He may strike the head from me, he may scourge me, he may load me with irons, but henceforth he shall never compel me either to love or to obey him. Go to him, then, and tell him that Gurth, the son of Beowulf, renounces his service." "Assuredly," said Wamba. "Fool as I am, I shall not do your fool's errand. Cedric hath another javelin stuck into his girdle, and thou knowest he does not always miss his mark." "I care not," replied Gurth, "how soon he makes a mark of me. Yesterday he left Wilfred, my young master, in his blood. Today he has striven to kill before my face the only other living creature that ever showed me kindness. By Saint Edmund, Saint Dunstan, Saint Withold, and Saint Edward the Confessor, and every other Saxon saint in the calendar. for Cedric never swore by any that was not of Saxon lineage, and all his household had the same limited devotion. "I will never forgive him." "To my thinking now," said the Jester, who was frequently wont to act as peacemaker in the family, "our master did not propose to hurt Fangs, but only to affright him. For if you observed, he rose in his stirrups, as thereby meaning to overcast the mark, and so he would have done, but Fangs, happening to bound up at the very moment, received a scratch, which I will be bound to heal with a penny's breadth of tar." "If I thought so," said Gurth, "if I could but think so. But no, I saw the javelin was well aimed. I heard it whiz through the air with all the wrathful malevolence of him who cast it, and it quivered after it had pitched in the ground, as if with regret for having missed its mark. By the hog dear to Saint Anthony, I renounce him." And the indignant swineherd resumed his sullen silence, which no efforts of the Jester could again induce him to break. Meanwhile, Cedric and Athelstane, the leaders of the troop, conversed together on the state of the land, on the dissensions of the royal family, on the feuds and quarrels among the Norman nobles, and on the chance which there was that oppressed Saxons might be able to free themselves from the yoke of the Normans, or at least to elevate themselves into national consequence and independence during the civil convulsions which were likely to ensue. On this subject Cedric was all animation. The restoration of the independence of his race was the idol of his heart, to which he had willingly sacrificed domestic happiness and the interests of his own son. But, in order to achieve this great revolution in favour of the native English, it was necessary that they should be united among themselves, and act under an acknowledged head. The necessity of choosing their chief from the Saxon blood royal was not only evident in itself, but had been made a solemn condition by those whom Cedric had entrusted with his secret plans and hopes. Athelstane had this quality at least, and although he had few mental accomplishments or talents to recommend him as leader, he had still a goodly person, was no coward, had been accustomed to martial exercises, and seemed willing to defer to the advice of counsellors more wise than himself. Above all, he was known to be liberal and hospitable, and believed to be good-hearted. But whatever pretensions Athelstane had to be considered as head of the Saxon confederacy, many of that nation were disposed to prefer the title of the Lady Rowena, who drew her descent from Alfred, and whose father having been a chief renowned for wisdom, courage, and generosity, his memory was highly honoured by his oppressed countrymen. It would have been no difficult thing for Cedric, had he been so disposed, to have placed himself at the head of a third party, as formidable at least as any of the others. To counterbalance their royal descent, he had courage, activity, energy, and above all, that devoted attachment to the cause which had procured him the epithet of the Saxon, and his birth was inferior to none, excepting only that of Athelstane and his ward. These qualities, however, were unalloyed by the slightest shade of selfishness, and instead of dividing yet farther his weakened nation by forming a faction of his own, it was a leading part of Cedric's plan to extinguish that which already existed, by promoting a marriage betwixt Rowena and Athelstane. An obstacle occurred to this his favourite project, in the mutual attachment of his ward and his son, and hence the original cause of the banishment of Wilfred from the house of his father. This stern measure Cedric had adopted in the hopes that, during Wilfred's absence, Rowena might relinquish her preference, but in this hope he was disappointed, a disappointment which might be attributed in part to the mode in which his ward had been educated. Cedric, to whom the name of Alfred was as that of a deity, had treated the sole remaining scion of that great monarch with a degree of observance such as, perhaps, was in those days scarce paid to an acknowledged princess. Rowena's will had been in almost all cases a law to his household, and Cedric himself, as if determined that her sovereignty should be fully acknowledged within that little circle at least, seemed to take a pride in acting as the first of her subjects. Thus trained in the exercise not only of free will, but despotic authority, Rowena was, by her previous education, disposed both to resist and to resent any attempt to control her affections, or dispose of her hand contrary to her inclinations, and to assert her independence in a case which even those females who have been trained up to obedience and subjection are not infrequently apt to dispute the authority of guardians and parents. The opinions which she felt strongly, she avowed boldly, and Cedric, who could not free himself from his habitual deference to her opinions, felt totally at a loss how to enforce his authority of guardian. It was in vain that he attempted to dazzle her with the prospect of a visionary throne. Rowena, who possessed strong sense, neither considered his plan as practicable, nor as desirable so far as she was concerned, could it have been achieved. Without attempting to conceal her avowed preference of Wilfred of Ivanhoe, she declared that were that favoured knight out of question, she would rather take refuge in a convent than share a throne with Athelstane, whom, having always despised, she now began, on account of the trouble she received on his account, thoroughly to detest. Nevertheless, Cedric, whose opinions of women's constancy was far from strong, persisted in using every means in his power to bring about the proposed match, in which he conceived he was rendering an important service to the Saxon cause. The sudden and romantic appearance of his son in the lists at Ashby, he had justly regarded as almost a death's blow to his hopes. His paternal affection, it is true, had for an instant gained the victory over pride and patriotism, but both had returned in full force, and under their joint operation, he was now bent upon making a determined effort for the union of Athelstane and Rowena, together with expediting those other measures which seemed necessary to forward the restoration of Saxon independence. On this last subject he was now labouring with Athelstane, not without having reason, every now and then, to lament, like Hotspur, that he should have moved such a dish of skimmed milk to so honourable an action. Athelstane, it is true, was vain enough, and loved to have his ears tickled with tales of his high descent, and of his right by inheritance to homage and sovereignty. But his petty vanity was sufficiently gratified by receiving this homage at the hands of his immediate attendants, and of the Saxons who approached him. If he had the courage to encounter danger, he at least hated the trouble of going to seek it. And while he agreed in the general principles laid down by Cedric concerning the claim of the Saxons to independence, and was still more easily convinced of his own title to reign over them when that independence should be attained, yet when the means of asserting these rights came to be discussed, he was still Athelstane the unready, slow, irresolute, procrastinating, and unenterprising. The warm and impassioned exhortations of Cedric had as little effect upon his impassive temper as red-hot balls alighting in the water, which produced a little sound and smoke, and are instantly extinguished. If, leaving this task, which might be compared to spurring a tired jade, or to hammering upon cold iron, Cedric fell back to his ward Rowena, he received little more satisfaction from conferring with her. For as his presence interrupted the discourse between the lady and her favourite attendant upon the gallantry and fate of Wilfred, Elgitha failed not to revenge both her mistress and herself by recurring to the overthrow of Athelstane in the lists, the most disagreeable subject which could greet the ears of Cedric. To this sturdy Saxon, therefore, the day's journey was fraught with all manner of displeasure and discomfort, so that he more than once internally cursed the tournament, and him who had proclaimed it, together with his own folly in ever thinking of going thither. At noon, upon the motion of Athelstane, the travellers paused in a woodland shade by a fountain, to repose their horses and partake of some provisions, with which the hospitable abbot had loaded a sumpter mule. Their repast was a pretty long one, and these several interruptions rendered it impossible for them to hope to reach Rotherwood without travelling all night, a conviction which induced them to proceed on their way at a more hasty pace than they had hitherto used. Chapter 18. Chapter 19. A train of armed men, some noble dame escorting, so their scattered words discovered, as unperceived I hung upon their rear, are close at hand, and mean to pass the night within the castle. Ora, a tragedy. The travellers had now reached the verge of the wooded country, and were about to plunge into its recesses, held dangerous at that time from the number of outlaws whom oppression and poverty had driven to despair, and who occupied the forests in such large bands as could easily bid defiance to the feeble police of the period. From these rovers, however, notwithstanding the lateness of the hour, Cedric and Athelstane accounted themselves secure, as they had in attendance 10 servants, besides Wamba and Gurth, whose aid could not be accounted upon, the one being a jester and the other a captive. It may be added that in travelling thus late through the forest, Cedric and Athelstane relied on their descent and character, as well as their courage. The outlaws whom the severity of the forest laws had reduced to this roving and desperate mode of life were chiefly peasants and yeomen of Saxon descent, and were generally supposed to respect the persons and property of their countrymen. As the travellers journeyed on their way, they were alarmed by repeated cries for assistance, and when they rode up to the place from whence they came, they were surprised to find a horse-litter placed upon the ground, beside which sat a young woman, richly dressed in the Jewish fashion, while an old man, whose yellow cap proclaimed him to belong to the same nation, walked up and down with gestures expressive of the deepest despair, and wrung his hands as if affected by some strange disaster. To the inquiries of Athelstane and Cedric, the old Jew could for some time only answer by invoking the protection of all the patriarchs of the Old Testament, successively against the sons of Ishmael, who were coming to smite them, hip and thigh, with the edge of the sword. When he began to come to himself out of this agony of terror, Isaac of York, for it was our old friend, was at length able to explain that he had hired a bodyguard of 6 men at Ashby, together with mules for carrying the litter of a sick friend. This party had undertaken to escort him as far as Doncaster. They had come thus far in safety, but, having received information from a woodcutter that there was a strong band of outlaws lying in wait in the woods before them, Isaac's mercenaries had not only taken flight, but had carried off with them the horses which bore the litter, and left the Jew and his daughter without the means either of defence or of retreat, to be plundered and probably murdered by the banditti, who they expected every moment would bring down upon them. "Would it but please your valours," added Isaac, in a tone of deep humiliation, "to permit the poor Jews to travel under your safeguard. I swear by the tables of our law that never has favour been conferred upon a child of Israel since the days of our captivity, which shall be more gratefully acknowledged." "Dog of a Jew!" said Athelstane, whose memory was of that petty kind which stores up trifles of all kinds, but particularly trifling offences. "Dost not remember how thou didst beard us in the gallery at the tilt-yard? Fight or flee, or compound with the outlaws as thou dost list. Ask neither aid nor company from us, and if they rob only such as thee, who rob all the world, I, for mine own share, shall hold them right honest folk." Cedric did not assent to the severe proposal of his companion. "We shall do better," said he, "to leave them 2 of our attendants and 2 horses to convey them back to the next village. It will diminish our strength but little, and with your good sword, noble Athelstane, and the aid of those who remain, it will be light work for us to face 20 of those runagates." Rowena, somewhat alarmed by the mention of outlaws in force, and so near them, strongly seconded the proposal of her guardian. But Rebecca, suddenly quitting her dejected posture, and making her way through the attendants to the palfrey of the Saxon lady, knelt down, and after the oriental fashion in addressing superiors, kissed the hem of Rowena's garment. Then, rising and throwing back her veil, she implored her in the great name of the God whom they both worshipped, and by that revelation of the law upon Mount Sinai, in which they both believed, that she would have compassion upon them, and suffer them to go forward under their safeguard. "It is not for myself that I pray this favour," said Rebecca, "nor is it even for that poor old man. I know that to wrong and to spoil our nation is a light fault, if not a merit, with the Christians. And what is it to us whether it be done in the city, in the desert, or in the field? But it is in the name of one dear to many, and dear even to you, that I beseech you to let this sick person be transported with care and tenderness under your protection. For if evil chance him, the last moment of your life would be embittered with regret for denying that which I ask of you." The noble and solemn air with which Rebecca made this appeal gave it double weight with the fair Saxon. "The man is old and feeble," she said to her guardian, "the maiden young and beautiful, their friend sick and in peril of his life. Jews though they be, we cannot as Christians leave them in this extremity. Let them unload 2 of the sumpter mules, and put the baggage behind 2 of the serfs, and we have led horses for the old man and his daughter." Cedric readily assented to what she proposed, and Athelstane only added the condition, that they should travel in the rear of the whole party, where Wamba, he said, might attend them with his shield of boar's brawn. "I have left my shield in the tilt-yard," answered the jester, "as has been the fate of many a better knight than myself." Athelstane coloured deeply, for such had been his own fate on the last day of the tournament, while Rowena, who was pleased in the same proportion, as if to make amends for the brutal jest of her unfeeling suitor, requested Rebecca to ride by her side. "It were not fit I should do so," answered Rebecca, with proud humility, "where my society might be held a disgrace to my protectress." By this time the change of baggage was hastily achieved, for the single word outlaws rendered every one sufficiently alert, and the approach of twilight made the sound yet more impressive. Amid the bustle, Gurth was taken from horseback, in the course of which removal he prevailed upon the jester to slack the cord with which his arms were bound. It was so negligently refastened, perhaps intentionally, on the part of Wamba, that Gurth found no difficulty in freeing his arms altogether from bondage, and then, gliding into the thicket, he made his escape from the party. The bustle had been considerable, and it was some time before Gurth was missed, for as he was to be placed for the rest of the journey behind a servant, every one supposed that some other of his companions had him under his custody, and when it began to be whispered among them that Gurth had actually disappeared, they were under such immediate expectation of an attack from the outlaws, that it was not held convenient to pay much attention to the circumstance. The path upon which the party travelled was now so narrow as not to admit, with any sort of convenience, above 2 riders abreast, and began to descend into a dingle, traversed by a brook whose banks were broken, swampy, and overgrown with dwarf willows. Cedric and Athelstane, who were at the head of their retinue, saw the risk of being attacked at this pass, but neither of them having had much practice in war, no better mode of preventing the danger occurred to them than that they should hasten through the defile as fast as possible. Advancing, therefore, without much order, they had just crossed the brook with a part of their followers, when they were assailed in front, flank, and rear at once, with an impetuosity to which, in their confused and ill-prepared condition, it was impossible to offer effectual resistance. The shout of "A white dragon! A white dragon! Saint George for Merry England!" war cries adopted by the assailants, as belonging to their assumed character of Saxon outlaws, was heard on every side, and on every side enemies appeared with a rapidity of advance and attack which seemed to multiply their numbers. Both the Saxon chiefs were made prisoners at the same moment, and each under circumstances expressive of his character. Cedric, the instant that an enemy appeared, launched at him his remaining javelin, which, taking better effect than that which he had hurled at Fangs, nailed the man against an oak tree that happened to be close behind him. Thus far successful, Cedric spurred his horse against a second, drawing his sword at the same time, and striking with such inconsiderate fury, that his weapon encountered a thick branch which hung over him, and he was disarmed by the violence of his own blow. He was instantly made prisoner, and pulled from his horse by 2 or 3 of the banditti who crowded around him. Athelstane shared his captivity, his bridle having been seized, and he himself forcibly dismounted, long before he could draw his weapon, or assume any posture of effectual defence. The attendants, embarrassed with baggage, surprised and terrified at the fate of their masters, fell an easy prey to the assailants, while the Lady Rowena, in the centre of the cavalcade, and the Jew and his daughter in the rear, experienced the same misfortune. Of all the train none escaped except Wamba, who showed upon the occasion much more courage than those who pretended to greater sense. He possessed himself of a sword belonging to one of the domestics, who was just drawing it with a tardy and irresolute hand, laid it about him like a lion, drove back several who approached him, and made a brave, though ineffectual, attempt to succour his master. Finding himself overpowered, the jester at length threw himself from his horse, plunged into the thicket, and, favoured by the general confusion, escaped from the scene of action. Yet the valiant jester, as soon as he found himself safe, hesitated more than once whether he should not turn back, and share the captivity of a master to whom he was sincerely attached. "I have heard men talk of the blessings of freedom," he said to himself, "but I wish any wise man would teach me what use to make of it now that I have it." As he pronounced these words aloud, a voice very near him called out in a low and cautious tone, "Wamba!" and, at the same time, a dog, which he recognized to be Fangs, jumped up and fawned upon him. "Gurth!" answered Wamba, with the same caution, and the swineherd immediately stood before him. "What is the matter?" said he eagerly. "What mean these cries, and that clashing of swords?" "Only a trick of the times," said Wamba. "They are all prisoners." "Who are prisoners?" exclaimed Gurth impatiently. "My lord and my lady, and Athelstane, and Hundibert, and Oswald." "In the name of God," said Gurth, "how came they prisoners? And to whom?" "Our master was too ready to fight," said the jester, "and Athelstane was not ready enough, and no other person was ready at all. And they are prisoners to green cassocks and black visors, and they lie all tumbled about on the green like the crab apples that you shake down to your swine. And I would laugh at it," said the honest jester, "if I could for weeping." And he shed tears of unfeigned sorrow. Gurth's countenance kindled. "Wamba," he said, "thou hast a weapon, and thy heart was ever stronger than thy brain. We are only 2, but a sudden attack from men of resolution will do much. Follow me." "Whither, and for what purpose?" said the jester. "To rescue Cedric." "But you have renounced his service but now," said Wamba. "That," said Gurth, "was but while he was fortunate. Follow me." As the jester was about to obey, a third person suddenly made his appearance, and commanded them both to halt. From his dress and arms, Wamba would have conjectured him to be one of those outlaws who had just assailed his master. But besides that he wore no mask, the glittering baldric across his shoulder, with the rich bugle horn which it supported, as well as the calm and commanding expression of his voice and manner, made him, notwithstanding the twilight, recognize Locksley the yeoman, who had been victorious under such disadvantageous circumstances in the contest for the prize of archery. "What is the meaning of all this?" said he. or who is it that rifle and ransom and make prisoners in these forests?" "You may look at their cassocks close by," said Wamba, "and see whether they be thy children's coats or no, for they are as like thine own as one green pea-cod is to another." "I will learn that presently," answered Locksley, "and I charge ye, on peril of your lives, not to stir from the place where ye stand, until I have returned. Obey me, and it shall be the better for you and your masters. Yet stay, I must render myself as like these men as possible." So saying, he unbuckled his baldric with the bugle, took a feather from his cap, and gave them to Wamba, then drew a visor from his pouch, and, repeating his charges to them to stand fast, went to execute his purposes of reconnoitring. "Shall we stand fast, Gurth?" said Wamba, "or shall we e'en give him leg bail? In my foolish mind, he had all the equipage of a thief, too much in readiness to be himself a true man." "Let him be the devil," said Gurth, "and he will. We can be no worse of waiting his return. If he belong to that party, he must already have given them the alarm, and it will avail nothing either to fight or fly. Besides, I have late experienced that errant thieves are not the worst men in the world to have to deal with." The yeoman returned in the course of a few minutes. "Friend Gurth," he said, "I have mingled among yon men, and have learnt to whom they belong, and whither they are bound. There is, I think, no chance that they will proceed to any actual violence against their prisoners. For 3 men to attempt them at this moment were little ease than madness, for they are good men of war, and have, as such, placed sentinels to give the alarm when any one approaches. But I trust soon to gather such a force as may act in defiance of all their precautions. You are both servants, and, as I think, faithful servants, of Cedric the Saxon, the friend of the rights of Englishmen. He shall not want English hands to help him in this extremity. Come then with me, until I gather more aid." So saying, he walked through the wood at a great pace, followed by the jester and the swineherd. It was not consistent with Wamba's humour to travel long in silence. "I think," said he, looking at the baldric and bugle which he still carried, "that I saw the arrow shot which won this gay prize, and that not so long since as Christmas." "And I," said Gurth, "could take it on my halidom that I have heard the voice of the good yeoman who won it, by night as well as by day, and that the moon is not 3 days older since I did so." "Mine honest friends," replied the yeoman, "who or what I am is little to the present purpose. Should I free your master, you will have reason to think me the best friend you ever had in your lives, and whether I am known by one name or another, or whether I can draw a bow as well or better than a cow-keeper, or whether it is my pleasure to walk in sunshine or by moonlight, are matters which, as they do not concern you, so neither need ye busy yourselves respecting them." "Our heads are in the lion's mouth," said Wamba in a whisper to Gurth. "Get them out how we can." "Hush, be silent," said Gurth. "Offend him not by thy folly, and I trust sincerely that all will go well." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20. When autumn nights were long and drear, and forest walks were dark and dim, how sweetly on the pilgrim's ear was wont to steal the hermit's hymn. Devotion borrows music's tone, and music took devotion's wing, and, like the bird that hails the sun, they soar to heaven, and soaring sing. The Hermit of St. Clement's Well. It was after 3 hours' good walking that the servants of Cedric, with their mysterious guide, arrived at a small opening in the forest, in the centre of which grew an oak tree of enormous magnitude, throwing its twisted branches in every direction. Beneath this tree 4 or 5 yeomen lay stretched on the ground, while another, as sentinel, walked to and fro in the moonlight shade. Upon hearing the sound of feet approaching, the watch instantly gave the alarm, and the sleepers as suddenly started up and bent their bows. 6 arrows placed on the string were pointed towards the quarter from which the travellers approached, when their guide, being recognized, was welcomed with every token of respect and attachment, and all signs and fears of a rough reception at once subsided. "Where's the miller?" was his first question. "On the road towards Rotherham." "With how many?" demanded the leader, for such he seemed to be. "With 6 men, and good hope of booty, if it please St. Nicholas." "Devoutly spoken," said Locksley. "And where is Allan a Dale?" "Walked up towards the Watling Street, to watch for the Prior of Jorvaulx." "That is well thought on also," replied the captain. "And where is the friar?" "In his cell." "Thither will I go," said Locksley. "Disperse and seek your companions. Collect what force you can, for there's game afoot that must be hunted hard, and will turn to bay. Meet me here by daybreak. And stay," he added, "I have forgotten what is most necessary of the whole. 2 of you take the road quickly towards Torquilstone, the castle of Front de Bœuf. A set of gallants, who have been masquerading in such guise as our own, are carrying a band of prisoners thither. Watch them closely, for even if they reach the castle before we collect our force, our honour is concerned to punish them, and we will find means to do so. Keep a close watch on them, therefore, and dispatch one of your comrades, the lightest of foot, to bring the news of the yeomen thereabout." They promised implicit obedience, and departed with alacrity on their different errands. In the meanwhile, their leader and his 2 companions, who now looked upon him with great respect, as well as some fear, pursued their way to the chapel of Copmanhurst. When they had reached the little moonlight glade, having in front the reverend though ruinous chapel, and the rude hermitage so well suited to ascetic devotion, Wamba whispered to Gurth, "If this be the habitation of a thief, it makes good the old proverb, the nearer the church, the farther from God. And by my coxcomb," he added, "I think it be even so. Hearken but to the black sanctus which they are singing in the hermitage." In fact, the anchorite and his guest were performing, at the full extent of their very powerful lungs, an old drinking song, of which this was the burden: "Come, troll the brown bowl to me, bully boy, bully boy. Come, troll the brown bowl to me. Ho, jolly Jenkin, I spy a knave in drinking. Come, troll the brown bowl to me." "Now that is not ill sung," said Wamba, who had thrown in a few of his own flourishes, to help out the chorus. "But who, in the saint's name, ever expected to have heard such a jolly chant come from out a hermit's cell at midnight?" "Marry, that should I," said Gurth, "for the jolly clerk of Copmanhurst is a known man, and kills half the deer that are stolen in this walk. Men say that the keeper has complained to his official, and that he will be stripped of his cowl and cope altogether, if he keeps not better order." While they were thus speaking, Locksley's loud and repeated knocks had at length disturbed the anchorite and his guest. "By my beads," said the hermit, stopping short in a grand flourish, "here come more benighted guests. I would not for my cow that they found us in this goodly exercise. All men have their enemies, good Sir Sluggard, and there be those malignant enough to construe the hospitable refreshment which I have been offering to you, a weary traveller, for the matter of 3 short hours, into sheer drunkenness and debauchery, vices alike alien to my profession and my disposition." "Base calumniators," replied the knight, "I would I had the chastising of them. Nevertheless, holy clerk, it is true that all have their enemies, and there be those in this very land whom I would rather speak to through the bars of my helmet than barefaced." "Get thine iron pot on thy head, then, friend Sluggard, as quickly as thy nature will permit," said the hermit, "while I remove these pewter flagons, whose late contents run strangely in mine own pate, and to drown the clatter, for, in faith, I feel somewhat unsteady, strike into the tune which thou hearest me sing. It is no matter for the words, I scarce know them myself." So saying, he struck up a thundering De Profundis Clamavi, under cover of which he removed the apparatus of their banquet, while the knight, laughing heartily, and arming himself all the while, assisted his host with his voice from time to time, as his mirth permitted. "What devil's matins are you after at this hour?" said a voice from without. "Heaven forgive you, Sir Traveller," said the hermit, whose own noise, and perhaps his nocturnal potations, prevented from recognizing accents which were tolerably familiar to him. "Wend on your way, in the name of God and Saint Dunstan, and disturb not the devotions of me and my holy brother." "Mad priest," answered the voice from without, "open to Locksley." "All's safe, all's right," said the hermit to his companion. "But who is he?" said the Black Knight. "It imports me much to know." "Who is he?" answered the hermit. "I tell thee he is a friend." "But what friend?" answered the knight, "for he may be friend to thee, and none of mine." "What friend?" replied the hermit. "That now is one of the questions that is more easily asked than answered. What friend? Why, he is, now that I bethink me a little, the very same honest keeper I told thee of a while since." "Ay, as honest a keeper as thou art a pious hermit," replied the knight. "I doubt it not, but undo the door to him before he beat it from its hinges." The dogs, in the meantime, which had made a dreadful baying at the commencement of the disturbance, seemed now to recognize the voice of him who stood without, for, totally changing their manner, they scratched and whined at the door, as if interceding for his admission. The hermit speedily unbolted his portal, and admitted Locksley with his two companions. "Why, hermit," was the yeoman's first question as soon as he beheld the knight, "what boon companion hast thou here?" "A brother of our order," replied the friar, shaking his head. "We have been at our orisons all night." "He is a monk of the church militant, I think," answered Locksley, "and there be more of them abroad. I tell thee, friar, thou must lay down the rosary, and take up the quarterstaff; we shall need every one of our merry men, whether clerk or layman. But," he added, taking him a step aside, "art thou mad to give admittance to a knight thou dost not know? Hast thou forgot our articles?" "Not know him!" replied the friar, boldly. "I know him as well as the beggar knows his dish." "And what is his name, then?" demanded Locksley. "His name?" said the hermit. "His name is Sir Anthony of Scrabblestone, as if I would drink with a man, and did not know his name." "Thou hast been drinking more than enough, friar," said the woodsman, "and, I fear, prating more than enough, too." "Good yeoman," said the knight, coming forward, "be not wroth with my merry host. He did but afford me the hospitality which I would have compelled from him if he had refused it." "Thou compel?" said the friar. "Wait but till have changed this grey gown for a green cassock, and if I make not a quarterstaff ring 12 upon thy pate, I am neither true clerk nor good woodsman." While he spoke thus, he stripped off his gown, and appeared in a close black buckram doublet and drawers, over which he speedily did on a cassock of green, and hose of the same colour. "I pray thee, truss my points," said he to Wamba, "and thou shalt have a cup of sack for thy labour." "Gramercy for thy sack," said Wamba; "but think'st thou it is lawful for me to aid you to transmew thyself from a holy hermit into a sinful forester?" "Never fear," said the hermit, "I will but confess the sins of my green cloak to my grey friar's frock, and all shall be well again." "Amen," answered the jester. "A broadcloth penitent should have a sackcloth confessor, and your frock may absolve my motley doublet into the bargain." So saying, he accommodated the friar with his assistance in tying the endless number of points, as the laces which attached the hose to the doublet were then termed. While they were thus employed, Locksley led the knight a little apart, and addressed him thus: "Deny it not, Sir Knight, you are he who decided the victory to the advantage of the English against the strangers on the second day of the tournament at Ashby." "And what follows if you guess truly, good yeoman?" replied the knight. "I should, in that case, hold you," replied the yeoman, "a friend to the weaker party." "Such is the duty of a true knight, at least," replied the black champion, "and I would not willingly that there were reason to think otherwise of me." "But for my purpose," said the yeoman, "thou shouldst be as well a good Englishman as a good knight. For that which I have to speak of concerns, indeed, the duty of every honest man, but is more especially that of a true-born native of England." "You can speak to no one," replied the knight, "to whom England, and the life of every Englishman, can be dearer than to me." "I would willingly believe so," said the woodsman, "for never had this country such need to be supported by those who love her. Hear me, and I will tell thee of an enterprise, in which, if thou be'st really that which thou seemest, thou mayst take an honourable part. A band of villains, in the disguise of better men than themselves, have made themselves master of the person of a noble Englishman, called Cedric the Saxon, together with his ward and his friend Athelstane of Coningsburgh, and have transported them to a castle in this forest, called Torquilstone. I ask of thee, as a good knight and a good Englishman, wilt thou aid in their rescue?" "I am bound by my vow to do so," replied the knight. "But I would willingly know who you are who request my assistance in their behalf." "I am," said the forester, "a nameless man, but I am the friend of my country, and of my country's friends. With this account of me you must, for the present, remain satisfied, the more especially since you yourself desire to continue unknown. Believe, however, that my word, when pledged, is as inviolate as if I wore golden spurs." "I willingly believe it," said the knight. "I have been accustomed to study men's countenances, and I can read in thine honesty and resolution. I will, therefore, ask thee no further questions, but aid thee in setting at freedom those oppressed captives, which done, I trust we shall part better acquainted, and well satisfied with each other." "So," said Wamba to Gurth, for the friar being now fully equipped, the jester, having approached to the other side of the hut, had heard the conclusion of the conversation. "So we have got a new ally? I trust the valour of the knight will be truer metal than the religion of the hermit, or the honesty of the yeoman, for this Locksley looks like a born deer-stealer, and the priest like a lusty hypocrite." "Hold thy peace, Wamba," said Gurth. "It may all be as thou dost guess, but were the horned devil to rise and proffer me his assistance to set at liberty Cedric and the Lady Rowena, I fear I should hardly have religion enough to refuse the foul fiend's offer, and bid him get behind me." The friar was now completely accoutred as a yeoman, with sword and buckler, bow and quiver, and a strong partisan over his shoulder. He left his cell at the head of the party, and, having carefully locked the door, deposited the key under the threshold. "Art thou in condition to do good service, friar?" said Locksley, "or does the brown bowl still run in thy head?" "Not more than a draught of St. Dunstan's fountain will allay," answered the priest. "Something there is of a whizzing in my brain, and of instability in my legs, but you shall presently see both pass away." So saying, he stepped to the stone basin, in which the waters of the fountain as they fell formed bubbles which danced in the white moonlight, and took so long a draught as if he had meant to exhaust the spring. "When didst thou drink as deep a draught of water before, holy clerk of Copmanhurst?" said the Black Knight. "Never since my wine butt leaked, and let out its liquor by an illegal vent," replied the friar, "and so left me nothing to drink but my patron's bounty here." Then plunging his hands and head into the fountain, he washed from them all marks of the midnight revel. Thus refreshed and sobered, the jolly priest twirled his heavy partisan round his head with 3 fingers, as if he had been balancing a reed, exclaiming at the same time, "Where be those false ravishers, who carry off wenches against their will? May the foul fiend fly off with me, if I am not man enough for a dozen of them." "Swearest thou, holy clerk?" said the Black Knight. "Clerk me no clerks," replied the transformed priest. "By St. George and the Dragon, I am no longer a shaveling than while my frock is on my back. When I am cased in my green cassock, I will drink, swear, and woo a lass, with any blithe forester in the West Riding." "Come on, Jack Priest," said Locksley, "and be silent. Thou art as noisy as a whole convent on a holy eve, when the Father Abbot has gone to bed. Come on you too, my masters, tarry not to talk of it. I say, come on, we must collect all our forces, and few enough we shall have, if we are to storm the castle of Reginald Front de Bœuf." "What? Is it Front de Bœuf?" said the Black Knight, "who has stopped on the king's highway the king's liege subjects? Is he turned thief and oppressor?" "Oppressor he ever was," said Locksley. "And for thief," said the priest, "I doubt if ever he were even half so honest a man as many a thief of my acquaintance." "Move on, priest, and be silent," said the yeoman. "It were better you led the way to the place of rendezvous than say what should be left unsaid, both in decency and prudence." End of chapter 20.